There are truths in the galaxy so heavy that even the void seems to bend beneath them, truths carved into the marrow of warriors who were never meant to be ordinary men. I remember the first time I saw a space marine not as a distant legend roared across Vox networks, but as a living monument of flesh and ceramite. His shadow fell over the ground like a judgment. His presence made the air feel thinner, as if the world itself struggled to support the weight of what he had become. And in that moment, I understood something few civilians ever grasp, that the Emperor's angels of death are not symbols of hope. They are sacrifices that still breathe, and the cost of forging them is far higher than the Imperium ever admits aloud. Walk with me through these memories, through the forges, the whispers, the surgeries, the indoctrination, the awe, and the fear. If the tale resonates, let your voice join mine, so the chronicle does not fade into silence. I used to believe that the galaxy was intestate, divided between those who shaped its destiny and those who simply endured it. On my homeworld, endurance was the only virtue that mattered, because destiny never came to places like ours. It fell upon us like ash, choking the landscape in long, silent drifts of despair. Even now, after all that has happened, I can still remember the color of the sky during those early years. A dim, bruised violet, always heavy with dust from the mines gouged into the mountains. It wasn't a sky meant for dreams. It was a sky that pressed down upon you with the bleak reminder that survival was the greatest miracle you could ever hope for. We lived in hab blocks that groaned whenever the wind scraped claws of grit across the metal siding. Inside, the air tasted of sweat and recycled water, and food rations came stamped with the same stern warnings about waste and efficiency, as if the imperial creed itself were printed into every nutrient bar. My parents were laborers in a small manufactorum just outside the settlement walls, overseen by the usual mix of administratum clerks and those silent servitors who drifted through corridors like forgotten ghosts. I knew from a young age that this life was meant to continue unchanged for generations. You grew up, you worked, you suffered, and if you were fortunate, you died without attracting attention. That was the closest thing to peace most of us could imagine. Yet even amid such resignation, stories found their way into our world. They trickled down through the administratum broadcasts, through pilgrims passing between distant shrines, through the hushed whispers of aging veterans who gathered at the edge of the habs once the sun dipped behind the mined-out hills. These stories were not gentle things. They spoke of wars fought light years away, of Xenos horrors lurking in the void, of the Astronomicon burning across the darkness like the heartbeat of the master of mankind. And sometimes, if the teller was brave enough, they spoke of the Adeptus Astartes. The first time I heard the name, I thought it was a myth, something carved out of hope to give the tired and the dying a reason to hold on just a little longer. Angels of death, the legends called them, 8 feet tall, eyes that glowed like furnace embers, armor that turned aside bullets and blades with the indifference of a god. But the details that stayed with me were always the same. They were human once. Once. That word echoed through my mind like a pulse. What could turn a human being into something myth spoke about with reverence and fear in equal measure? The answer came sooner than I ever expected. When I was 9, a detachment of Astra Militarum passed through our settlement on the way to reinforce a war zone we only knew as a line of numbers on an administratum data slate. Their tanks rumbled across the streets with engines that seemed to exhale promethium fumes straight into the spines of the watchers gathered behind barriers. My father lifted me so I could look over the crowd, and I stared at the columns of armored soldiers with a strange mix of awe and dread. These men and women were not myths. They were real, and they carried themselves with the weary certainty of those who had seen the galaxy's cruelty far more clearly than we had. But even their presence could not compare to what followed. A figure emerged from the shadows of a transport craft, and the world seemed to lose its breath. He was massive, so tall that the air around him felt thinner, as if reality itself bent around his presence. His armor gleamed with the deep, sacred green of his chapter, marked by the sigils of battle and honor. The imperial aquila spread across his chest like a proclamation of divine purpose. Children stopped crying. Workers froze mid-step. Even the servitors hesitated, as if the scraps of humanity buried in their programming recognized something too ancient for circuits to forget. No one spoke, no one dared to. The Astartes stepped forward, each movement measured and monumental. His vox grill filtered a voice that resonated like a distant avalanche, instructing the planetary officials to provide supplies and rest for the passing regiment. But I barely heard the words. All I could focus on was the feeling that radiated from him, an aura not of warmth or comfort, but of absolute inevitability. He was the Emperor's will made flesh, the edge of a blade drawn from a scabbard forged in distant epochs. And as he turned his helm slightly, scanning the gathered citizens, I felt my entire world narrow into a single piercing thought. I wanted to be what he was, not for glory, not for escape, but because in that moment I realized that I had never seen a human being who looked unbreakable. That night, long after the regiment had moved on and the Astartes had left our settlement as silently as he had arrived, I lay awake listening to the wind claw at the hab walls. I tried to imagine what it felt like to be inside that armor, to carry strength enough to silence a restless world, to stride into the abyss and carve meaning into the howl of endless war. I did not yet understand what an Astartes truly was, nor what they endured, nor what they surrendered. I only understood that my life felt unbearably small by comparison. But fate does not shape itself according to longing. The Imperium is too vast, too indifferent for that. Weeks passed, then months. The sight of the Astartes became a fading memory, pressed flat beneath the monotony of life in the Habs. My parents never spoke about him again. They feared that my fascination was dangerous, that dreaming of such heights would blind me to the simple truths needed for survival. They told me stories of aspirants who tried for glory and died nameless in the attempt, bones lost in mountain passes, or forest trials, or urban ruins used by chapters across the galaxy to measure the worth of the young. Still, the spark remained. I trained in secret, using broken weights, scavenged from the Manufactorum's scrap piles. I stared at the mountains beyond the settlement walls, and imagined what trials might unfold in their shadows. I memorized every rumor about which chapters operated in our sector, whether they drew recruits from worlds like ours, whether they passed through often or rarely, or never at all. For all my quiet discipline, I still expected that if destiny ever came, it would come like a whisper, a gentle summons, a chance offered by the gods of war. The truth was far colder. It was early morning when the administratum sirens cut through the settlement like blades of sound. The workers gathered quickly in the central plaza, confused and anxious. Even the overseers looked uneasy, their data slates shaking in their hands. Then the skies opened with roaring engines, and 2 Thunderhawk dropships descended in perfect formation, their armored hulls catching the dim violet light like falling shards of judgment. Dust swirled around the landing pads as the ship's ramps lowered, and a squad of Astartes emerged, each one towering, armored, and utterly still beneath their helmets. The chapter's colors were the same sacred green I remembered. For a moment, no one moved. It felt as if the entire world had been reduced to the sound of engines cooling and hearts pounding in fragile mortal chests. Then the tallest of the Astartes stepped forward, his voice echoing across the plaza with the force of a decree. By edict of our chapter master, and by right of selection granted by the High Lords of Terra, this world shall offer its strongest youth for evaluation. Those of suitable age will come forward. The crowd rippled with panic. Mothers held their children close. Fathers clenched fists that would break against Astartes' armor without leaving a mark. The officials stammered half-formed protests that no one listened to. I felt my throat tighten as my age group was called, my name included among dozens of others. My parents turned to me, their faces pale, their eyes searching for something they knew they could not hold back. My mother's voice trembled when she whispered, "You owe us nothing but your life. Remember that." My father said nothing. He only rested a hand on my head, a gesture so soft it felt like it belonged in another universe. I stepped forward because I had no choice, but also because I wanted to. Wanting and being chosen were not the same, yet both pushed me toward those armored giants who watched us with unblinking resolve. The Astartes evaluated us in silence, scanning our bodies, gauging our movements, measuring intangible qualities that no mortal instructor could ever have recognized. Some children were dismissed immediately, ushered back into the crowd with relief and sorrow mingling in the air around them. Others were set aside for further testing. I stood among the latter. When the tests were complete, a handful of us remained thin silhouettes against the metallic gleam of the Thunderhawk ramps. I could not feel my legs. I could barely breathe. The Astartes spoke again, announcing the names of those selected for immediate transport to the chapter's world. My name rose among them, echoing back at me as if spoken by someone else entirely. My parents did not call out. They knew better than to challenge the will of the Emperor's angels. Instead, they watched in aching silence as I walked toward the ramp. I did not look back. I was afraid that if I saw their faces, I would lose whatever resolve had carried me this far. Inside the Thunderhawk, the reality of the moment settled over me like a weighted shroud. The metal floor vibrated beneath my boots, resonating with the pulse of engines primed for ascent. Other chosen children sat nearby, some trembling, others numb. We were silent, not by order, but by instinct. Even the Astartes escorting us did not speak as they secured the restraints and prepared for launch. When the engines roared to life, the world outside became a blur of dust and fading violet sky. The settlement shrank until it looked like a pattern etched into a distant surface, and then it vanished beneath the clouds entirely. I had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. Whatever future waited for me was already spiraling into motion with the rising altitude. But even then, amid the fear, amid the uncertainty, amid the weight of everything I was leaving behind, a strange whisper of pride wound itself into my thoughts. I was going to join the legends, or die trying. Either way, the boy I had been was already fading. The journey to the chapter's world felt longer than any stretch of time I had known before. I learned later that days had passed, but inside that Thunderhawk and later the strike cruiser's cavernous hold, time dissolved into a thick uncertainty that clung to my thoughts like dust. The other chosen children, faces pale beneath flickering lumen strips, barely spoke. The few who tried managed only hushed fragments, as if the air itself might punish them for breaking the silence. Above us, the Astartes stood like statues carved from myth, their armor shifting only when absolutely necessary. Their presence a constant reminder that this was not a rescue and not an invitation. It was a judgment. We were not told the name of the world we were heading for. We were not told the name of the system, the chapter, or the purpose of the tests to come. Even now, I realize how deliberate that was. Knowledge breeds certainty, and the trials we were approaching required none of it. They wanted us, raw, stripped of pride, context, and hope. They wanted us as blank as the steel corridors we marched through once the ship finally anchored itself in orbit. When the hatches opened and the ramps lowered, cold wind swept inside like a living thing, sharp enough to sting the skin. We were ordered out onto a rocky plateau under a sky the color of storm-forged iron. The landscape stretched in every direction, barren and severe. Jagged cliffs rose on the horizon, their peaks etched with the faint silhouettes of fortress towers. Snow drifted in thin sheets across the ground, gathering in crevices carved by centuries of relentless weather. The Astartes waiting for us were different from those who had collected us from my homeworld. Their armor carried deeper scars, their pauldrons marked with symbols that I did not yet understand but felt the gravity of. One stepped forward, broad-shouldered, helm crowned with a scarred crest, and spoke in a voice that felt like thunder rolling inside a cavern. You stand at the threshold of an existence few can comprehend. Some of you will cross, most of you will die. Those who live will never again be the person who arrived here. We exchanged glances, but none of us dared to show fear. The wind swallowed our breath before it could become visible. The trials began immediately. They led us down a narrow pass into a vast training ground built of stone, ice, and metal. It felt impossibly ancient, as if the foundation predated the Imperium itself. Every surface was cold to the touch. Every shadow carried the weight of unspoken histories. The first test was endurance, simple in concept, brutal in execution. We were ordered to run, not for minutes, not for hours, but until every muscle felt as if it were tearing apart, until the taste of iron crept into our mouths, and our lungs burned with a rawness that no breath could soothe. Some fell within the first hour. They were dragged away by silent servitors, their faces twisted with shock more than pain. Those who remained kept running because stopping meant the certainty of failure, and failure meant death. Even at that age, we understood this truth instinctively. The Astartes were not here to coddle us. They were here to strip away the weak and reveal whatever fragments of potential remained. By nightfall, if one could call that dim, frozen transition night, we were brought into a stone barracks carved directly into the cliff face. Inside, torches cast wavering light across the walls, illuminating the faces of the survivors. I counted 30 of us. We had begun with nearly triple that number. Some children slept immediately, collapsing onto the cold floors with the desperate relief of the near-dead. Others sat upright, staring blankly at nothing, their bodies shaking from exertion. I forced myself to stay awake, listening to every sound around me, trying to memorize the breathing patterns of those who seemed stronger. I wanted to know who my competitors were, and who would fall next. The idea of competition felt wrong at first, too cold, too cruel. But the longer I stayed in that frozen barracks, the more I understood that this was not cruelty, it was clarity. Only one path existed here: forward. Anyone who failed to move along it disappeared. The next day tested our courage. We were taken into the mountains, higher and deeper into the labyrinthine stone structures that the chapter had carved out over millennia. This time, the challenge was simple: climb. No safety harnesses, no ropes, no guidance. The rock was slick with ice, the winds unpredictable, the drop beneath us fatal. A few aspirants lost their grip and plunged into the shadows below. Their screams were brief, swallowed by the cold with merciless efficiency. I climbed until my fingers bled. The cold crept into my bones, threatening to numb me into stillness. But every time I faltered, I saw the towering forms of the Astartes watching us from the ledges above, silent, stern, waiting. Their gazes were not encouraging. They simply observed, gauging our worth with eyes that had seen centuries of war. By the time I reached the top, my hands were shredded, and the skin of my arms was cut by jagged stone. I collapsed onto the plateau, chest heaving, too exhausted to celebrate the victory. Only 22 of us had made it. The others would never be seen again. That night, in the barracks, I overheard 2 aspirants whispering about the next stage. They said the real tests hadn't even begun yet, that these were merely the filters used to discard the weakest before the true selection took place. Some chapters were rumored to use trials that broke the mind instead of the body. Others forced children into labyrinths filled with beasts that had no place in mortal environments. Some were said to put weapons into the hands of the aspirants and force them to fight one another until only one remained. The Whisperers didn't sleep after sharing those rumors. Neither did I. The following morning shattered any doubts we had about the brutality to come. We were escorted into a cavern lit by bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls like bruises of pale blue light. The air shimmered with particulate matter from unseen vents, giving the space an eerie, dreamlike quality. At the center of the cavern stood a cluster of cages, each one holding a creature drawn from nightmares. Some were feral beasts native to the planet's wilderness. Others were mutations, twisted shapes of muscle and bone that snarled, hissed, or scraped claws across the bars. The Astartes assigned a creature to each of us. Our task was straightforward: survive. They unlocked my cage first. The creature inside was smaller than the others, but no less deadly. It moved with predatory grace, its body low to the ground, its eyes reflecting the faint blue glow like twin shards of frozen fire. The moment the cage door swung open, it lunged. I did not think. Thinking would have killed me. Instead, instinct guided my movements. Instinct forged through years of watching workers fight over ration scraps. Instinct sharpened by fear that had shaped my childhood. I rolled aside, feeling claws slice the air beside my ear. The creature landed and pivoted with fluid precision. It was faster than me, stronger than me, built for killing. I had nothing but my hands and the unforgiving terrain beneath my feet. When it leapt again, I grabbed a shard of stone from the cavern floor and swung blindly. Luck or something like it guided the blow. The shard embedded itself in the creature's throat. It staggered, choked, and collapsed, its life spilling out in ragged breaths that echoed in the cavern like broken whispers. Around me, other aspirants fought their own battles. Some triumphed through cleverness or ferocity, others fell quickly beneath claws and teeth. When the last echoes of violence faded, only 15 of us remained. We were bleeding, trembling, exhausted, but alive. The Astartes approached, scanning us with inscrutable intensity. One kneeling giant tapped a rune on his vambrace and spoke into his vox grill, his voice distorted by static. Stage 1 complete. Proceed to cognitive assessment. Cognitive assessment. Those words, spoken with cold precision, chilled me more deeply than the cavern's icy air. This was not just about strength or endurance. They wanted to know what lived inside our minds, what choices we made under pressure, what shadows shaped our thoughts. We were led into a chamber filled with holographic arrays, each one designed to test memory, logic, tactical awareness, even emotional resilience. They showed us imagery meant to provoke fear or confusion. They asked questions that made no sense, then measured our reactions to the contradictions. They forced us to simulate battlefield decisions, selecting which hypothetical civilians to save or sacrifice, which allies to protect or abandon, how to respond when no option was truly moral. By the end of the tests, my head felt as if it had been carved open and hollowed out. Yet I also felt something else, something I did not fully understand at the time. It was the realization that these trials were forging us, reshaping us, uncovering pieces of ourselves we never knew existed. We were being broken down so completely that only the essential remained. When the assessment concluded, the Astartes formed a circle around the remaining aspirants. The largest stepped forward, removing his helmet with a slow, deliberate movement. His face was marked with scars that seemed to tell stories of wars older than any of us. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, but they burned with a fierce intelligence that felt more daunting than his armor. "You are fewer than we expected," he said. "Fewer than we hoped. Yet, you stand before us nonetheless. The path ahead will demand more than this. It will demand everything you are, everything you have been, and everything you will ever be. But if you survive, you will be reborn." His words settled over us like a shroud. Reborn. I looked at the faces of the other children, dirty, bruised, exhausted, and terrified. We had survived each other. The mountains, the creatures, and the tests designed to unravel the mind. But this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead in these frozen mountains would strip us further still. As the Astartes led us out of the cavern and into the night wind again, I understood that the boy who had left his homeworld was vanishing piece by piece. The mountain air tasted sharper now, carrying the unmistakable scent of transformation. I did not know if I would survive it. I did not know if I wanted to, but I kept walking because there was no turning back, and because the path to becoming more than human always begins with shedding the remnants of what you once were. Sleep became a myth in the days that followed. The barracks felt colder, the wind harsher, the stone floors somehow sharper beneath our thin bedding. Yet none of that compared to the weight settling inside my chest, a heaviness made not of fear, but of anticipation. I sensed that everything we had survived thus far was a prelude, a narrowing of the path that led us towards something far darker. The Astartes offered no explanations. They commanded, we obeyed. That was the rhythm, as constant as the storm winds that prowled the fortress walls outside. When they woke us on the fourth morning, the sky was still swallowed by a swirling blizzard that turned the air into a field of spinning knives. We were ordered outside without additional gear. Frost already crusted the edges of the stone courtyard, and the cold felt alive, nipping at exposed skin with calculated cruelty. The Astartes stood motionless in their armor, utterly indifferent to the conditions. I envied them not their size, not their power, but the way the elements treated them as if they weren't human at all. A voice echoed through the courtyard, amplified by a vox grill that seemed to make the wind itself flinch. "Today you will unlearn yourselves." The phrasing confused me at first, but the intent behind it seeped in slowly. They didn't just want to test us anymore, they wanted to erase us. We were marched through a series of stone tunnels beneath the mountain, each one dimly lit by cold, flickering lumens. The deeper we went, the more claustrophobic the air became. The walls seemed to press inward, the ceiling lowering with each step until even the smallest among us had to duck to avoid scraping their heads. At last, We arrived in a vast chamber cut from the living rock. Its floor was covered in fine dust that tasted faintly metallic, as though something ancient had been ground down to powder and left to decay. The Astartes spread out around the perimeter. One of them stepped forward, holding a small device in his armored hands, a cube etched with runes and sigils whose meanings were lost to me. He pressed a recessed panel, and a pulse of sound rippled through the air. It wasn't loud, but the moment it passed through my skull, I felt something shift, like a tremor in the foundation of my thoughts. The tests began. They asked questions again, like during the cognitive assessments, but this time the questions came faster, layered atop one another, overlapping until they felt like shards of thought being hurled into our minds. Some were simple: names, dates, tasks. Others were impossible riddles or contradictory statements delivered with cold precision. Between questions, they barked orders: stand, sit, kneel, rise, speak, silence. If we hesitated, we were struck by the flat of an Astartes gauntlet or jolted by a device that sent pain lancing through our limbs. This was not training, it was dismantling. Their goal was not to break the body we had done that, ourselves during the mountain trials, but to fracture the way we understood ourselves, to peel away pride, memory, identity, until all that remained was a hollow vessel waiting to be filled with purpose. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. The chamber was timeless, a cocoon of stone and pressure that dissolved the concept of time entirely. I felt sweat freezing on my skin, felt the tremors in my muscles as commands changed without warning. At some point, I became aware of the boy beside me, a wiry child from the mines whose name I had never learned, sobbing quietly as an Astartes interrogated him with relentless calm. "What are you?" the warrior demanded. "Aspirant," the boy stuttered. "What were you?" "A worker," he said, voice breaking. "Wrong," the Astartes replied. "You were nothing," the boy whimpered, and something inside me twisted. The Astartes wasn't insulting him, he was erasing him. When my turn came, the questions struck like hammer blows. "What do you fear? Who are you? Why do you fight? What claim do you have to existence? What is the Emperor to you?" I answered, because I had to, because silence brought punishment. But each answer felt less certain than the last. I could feel parts of myself slipping away like sand through my fingers. The boy who had lived in the settlement, who had watched a green-armored giant stride across a dusty plaza, who had left behind parents who loved him, that child was fading. Eventually, the interrogations ceased, but the silence they left behind was worse. The Astartes withdrew from the chamber, leaving us alone in the flickering blue lumens. Some children stood rigidly, trying to maintain composure. Others curled in on themselves. I sat on the cold floor, breathing shallowly, feeling the slow unraveling of everything familiar inside my mind. Then the floor shifted. No warning, no explanation. The stone beneath us trembled and slid apart, revealing a network of passageways plunging downward. The lumens blinked out instantly, plunging the chamber into a choking, lightless void. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the cavern entrances yawning below. A voice thundered from above, echoing off unseen heights. "Find your way out, or die." The floor dropped completely. I fell for a moment that felt like eternity before landing on a slope of loose gravel that sent me tumbling into a tunnel. Agony flared in my shoulder as it struck a jutting rock. Darkness swallowed everything, thick and absolute. The only sound was the ragged breathing of terrified children scattered throughout the maze. I pushed myself upright, trying not to gasp from the pain radiating down my arm. The tunnel ahead was impossibly narrow, the ceiling so low I had to crawl. My fingers brushed cold stone, then something softer fabric, perhaps, or hair. A whisper rose in the darkness, too soft to make out, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Someone was close, maybe only inches away, but in this labyrinth, proximity meant nothing. We were all the same, frightened, disoriented, uncertain whether our companions were alive or dead. The crawl space widened suddenly, leading into a cavern, where a faint, bluish glow filtered down from a crack in the ceiling. The light revealed claw marks etched into the wall's deep gouges that suggested the presence of something far larger than any child. Of course, the Astartes would not throw us into a maze without predators. Fear flared in my throat, hot and suffocating, survival instincts sharpened. I scanned the cavern for exits and found 2 tunnels branching off in opposite directions. One was wide, sloping gently downward. The other was narrow, jagged, and steep. Both were dark enough to conceal anything. Soft movement echoed through the chamber behind me. I didn't look back. Looking would only make the fear tangible, give it shape. I chose the narrow tunnel, forcing my body into spaces barely large enough to accommodate my frame. The stone scraped my elbows and knees with every movement, leaving a trail of blood that glistened in the faint light before being swallowed by the dark. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes again. Time dissolved in the maze, merging with dread until both felt indistinguishable. I heard other aspirants screaming in distant tunnels, the sound cutting abruptly as if devoured by the stone. I heard low growls reverberating from caverns I dared not enter. At one point, I encountered another child, an older girl with short hair and eyes wide with exhaustion. She grabbed my arm, whispering frantically, "There's something behind me, don't go that way." I nodded and followed her through a crevice that led into a vertical shaft. We climbed in silence, using the rough stone for handholds, our breaths loud in the enclosed space. At the top of the shaft, we reached a ledge overlooking a chasm so deep it seemed to swallow sound entirely. A narrow bridge of stone extended across it, barely wider than my feet. "We have to cross," she whispered, but she never did. A shadow flickered in the darkness behind her, followed by a guttural snarl. She spun, eyes flashing with terror, just as the creature lunged. It was not large, but its muscles writhed beneath mottled skin, and its jaws split horizontally in a grotesque way. The impact knocked her off the ledge. She didn't scream. The darkness swallowed her. The creature turned toward me, its eyes glowing faintly with predatory instinct. I retreated onto the stone bridge, feeling the void yawning beneath my boots. The beast followed, moving with terrifying agility across the narrow path. I could not outrun it. I could not fight it. The only advantage I had was the bridge itself. As the creature paused to gauge my movement, I stomped on the loose stones near the edge. The bridge trembled. One side cracked. The beast lunged, and the stone beneath it collapsed. It plunged into the abyss, shrieking as it fell. I remained still until the echoes faded. The path ahead was empty. By the time I found the exit, my body was shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled into a chamber illuminated by torches, where several Astartes stood waiting. Only 5 of us emerged. The warriors regarded us with no surprise, no approval, no acknowledgement of the ordeal we had endured. Their judgment had always been in our ability to endure the next test, not in the victory of surviving the previous. One of the Astartes stepped forward. "You have shed more of yourselves," he said. "That is good. The self is a burden you must learn to discard." His words lingered as we were escorted back to the barracks. I felt hollow. A part of me was missing. I could not name it, but I felt its absence as clearly as the ache in my bones. I realized then that the maze had not been designed to test navigation or combat. It had been designed to force us to confront the fear of isolation, the terror of losing identity in the dark. It had stripped away certainty, comfort, and the illusion of safety. It had revealed who we were beneath the fragile shell of childhood. And for the first time, I understood the truth. Becoming an Astartes was not about growing stronger. It was about becoming something new, something forged from pain, fear, and purpose. We slept little that night. The wind outside roared like a primal beast, shaking the walls of the barracks. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of the girl's fall, the creature's snarl, the silent steps of the Astartes watching us. I felt a strange sensation beneath the exhaustion, a slow, unsettling shift inside my mind, like tectonic plates grinding into alignment. The breaking had begun. The dawn that followed the maze felt heavier than the ones before it, as if the sky itself had grown curious about the children who refused to die. The storms above the fortress eased into a pale, frigid calm, revealing a horizon lined with the jagged silhouettes of towers whose exact purpose we still didn't understand. Every structure here seemed carved from the same ancient stone, shaped by centuries of storms, war, and the relentless will of the chapter. Each piece of architecture spoke a silent warning. Time meant nothing in this place. Only endurance mattered. We were summoned at first light. The Astartes appeared at the barracks entrance, wordless as always, and gestured for us to follow. Their armor clanked softly against the stone floor, the sound strangely rhythmic, almost ceremonial. The remaining 5 of us exchanged glances, each of us still bearing the marks of the previous trials. Torn skin, bruised limbs, hollowed eyes that hadn't yet recovered from what we'd seen in the underground labyrinth. The Astartes led us into the heart of the fortress, deeper than we'd ever been allowed before. The air changed as we descended. It grew warmer, thicker, laced with scents that reminded me faintly of oil and incense, as if sacred machinery thrummed endlessly behind the walls. The corridors widened into vast halls, illuminated by braziers burning blue-white flames, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the stone tiles. The deeper we went, the more I sensed something watching us, not a presence, not a mind, but an awareness woven into the very architecture. The fortress felt alive, not sentient, but ancient, a repository of countless memories and failures and triumphs. It felt as though the walls had witnessed thousands of children walking the same path we now trod, judged by the same giants who walked ahead of us. At last, we entered a chamber unlike any we had seen before. The ceiling arched so high it vanished into darkness. Rows of metallic slabs lined the walls, each fitted with restraints and surrounded by machinery whose purpose remained unclear. Strange sigils were carved into the floor, forming patterns that seemed to pulse softly with hidden power. Servitors drifted along the perimeter, blank-eyed things with metal limbs and surgical tools integrated into their bodies. Their presence filled me with a cold dread. This chamber was not meant for training, it was meant for transformation. An Astartes removed his helmet, revealing a face hardened by centuries of war. His gaze swept across us, lingering on each of the 5 survivors. "You have been judged worthy of the next stage," he said. "Your bodies will be remade. Your flesh will be reforged into something capable of hosting the gifts the Emperor intended for his angels. The process will break you. It will scar you. It may kill you. But if you survive, you will take the first step toward becoming Astartes." One boy beside me whispered, "What if we refuse?" The Astartes did not even turn his head. Refusal is death. Acceptance is also death. Survival is the only answer. Another warrior activated a control panel near the wall, and the metallic slabs hummed as the restraints opened, inviting us forward like the jaws of a slumbering beast. None of us moved at first. Then a girl, the youngest of us, but fierce in ways I admired, stepped forward and lay down on one of the slabs. The servitors converged on her instantly, their whirring limbs moving with unsettling grace. One by one, the rest of us followed. When I lay back on the slab, the restraints closed around my wrists, ankles, and chest with a cold finality. The metal felt colder than the mountain air, but the warmth of the chamber made sweat bead on my skin. I stared upward, searching for any detail in the darkness above that could anchor my thoughts. There was nothing. Something hissed near my ear. A servitor leaned over me, its face a patchwork of flesh and metal, its eyes dead yet somehow attentive. It held a vial of golden liquid with the faint luminescence of sacred oils. The Astartes spoke again. "This is the beginning. We implant the initiates with the first organs. The pain will be unlike anything you have known. Do not disgrace yourselves." Then the agony began. Needles pierced my skin. Tubes slid beneath my ribs. I felt something hot and viscous enter my bloodstream, burning through my veins like molten metal. My back arched against the restraints, but they held firm, denying even the smallest instinctive movement. My vision blurred as the servitors inserted something into my abdomen, an organ not born of nature, but forged through centuries of gene sorcery and biological mastery. I felt it settle inside me, heavy, foreign, throbbing in rhythm with a heartbeat that was not entirely mine. They continued. Every new organ brought a wave of agony so intense it seemed to fold my consciousness in on itself. There were moments when I felt myself leaving my body, hovering above it as though the pain had fractured the link between flesh and mind. At other times, I felt trapped inside my skull, screaming silently while the machinations of the servitors reshaped me without mercy. Somewhere in the haze, I heard another child begging for it to stop. His voice cracked, desperate. The Astartes stood unmoved. Pain meant nothing to them. It was the currency of rebirth. Hours blurred, maybe days. Time lost all meaning as the implants continued, each new addition forcing my body to adapt, reject, or die. The thought that death might be a release flickered through my mind more than once. Yet amidst the agony, a strange clarity emerged. This suffering was not punishment, it was a forge. The boy I had been was already gone, stripped away in the silence of that stone labyrinth, dissolved in the trials of the mountain. What remained was something raw, exposed, waiting to be rebuilt. At last, the restraints loosened. I gasped as air returned to my lungs fully, as though I had been drowning for hours without realizing it. The servitors withdrew, their work complete. The Astartes approached each of us in turn, examining our vitals, checking the readings displayed on small, humming devices attached to our slabs. 3 of us survived. The girl who had stepped forward first was gone. Her slab was empty, the sheets stained with dark, dried blood. The boy who had questioned the Astartes earlier now lay stiff and motionless, his skin pale, eyes unfocused. Only I and 2 others, brothers now, not by blood, but by ordeal, remained breathing. The Astartes nodded, neither pleased nor disappointed. You live, that is enough. We were helped off the slabs, though helped felt inaccurate. More accurately, we were guided, stumbling and half-conscious, into a new chamber connected to the fortress's inner sanctum. Warmth enveloped us, accompanied by the faint scent of incense and the hum of sacred machinery. Here, robed tech priests chanted in binary cant, their mechadendrites weaving intricate patterns through the air as they monitored our newly implanted organs. They spoke rarely, but when they did, it was with reverence, not for us, but for the biological masterpieces now grafted into our bodies. We were vessels, nothing more. Vessels they would fill with power until our humanity fractured and reshaped itself around something greater. We spent the night, or what felt like a night, lying on cots surrounded by humming machines. Fever raged through me, waves of heat crashing against waves of freezing chills. My stomach convulsed as the new organ fought for dominance, attempting to integrate into my system. At one point, I felt as though my bones were lengthening. At another, I was sure my heart had stopped entirely. Sleep came in brief, violent bursts filled with visions I could not control. I saw figures clad in power armor marching across battlefields drenched in fire. I saw worlds torn apart, skies streaked with streaks of plasma and the burning trails of drop pods. I saw a giant clad in the same sacred green armor, his presence neither comforting nor terrifying, merely absolute. And beneath it all, a whisper pulsed through my dreams, a voice not my own, deep and resonant. Rise. When I opened my eyes again, the fever had broken. One of the surviving boys sat nearby, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You made it, he said, his voice rough. I wasn't sure any of us would. I nodded. Words felt unnecessary. We were beyond introductions now, beyond the need to share our histories. Everything that mattered had been burned into our bodies. The tech priest overseeing our recovery approached, its vox-capable mouth clicking softly. Your bodies have accepted the implants, it stated. Further gene seed will follow. You are not yet Astartes, but you are no longer baseline humans. Adaptation will continue. Then it leaned closer, metal, joint whirring softly. Pain is expected. Endure, endure. The word echoed through my skull as we were escorted from the chamber and brought into a hall lined with statues of ancient warriors. Each was carved with impossible detail, stern visages, scarred armor, postures of unwavering resolve. They towered above us, reminders of what we were still far from becoming. Yet, for the first time, I sensed something stir within me that did not belong to the frightened child I had once been. It was not pride, it was not strength, it was a strange, simmering certainty, a knowledge that I had stepped irrevocably onto a path that led only forward. One of the Astartes stepped beside me, towering yet silent. He regarded the statues without emotion. These were our predecessors, he said, monuments to those who endured the same trials you now face. Remember their faces. You may join them one day, or you may join the dead at their feet. I looked at the statues again, noting the faint engravings of names and deeds etched into their bases. Some bore scars where details had been worn away by time. Others stood pristine, as though untouched by the centuries. I wondered what stories lay behind each carving, what fears had haunted these warriors before transformation had burned them away. The Astartes placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture so heavy it felt like the weight of history pressing down upon me. "Steel your mind," he said, and then he walked away. In that moment, I realized that the breaking was not complete. My body had been reshaped, but my mind, my spirit, still clung to fragments of self that the chapter intended to burn away. Ahead lay more trials, more agony, more transformation. The forging of my body was only the beginning. The forging of my soul would demand far more. As the torches flickered and shadows danced across the statues' ancient faces, I felt the first stirrings of something vast and unknown inside me, a shape forming in the fire, a purpose whispered by the void. And I understood, with cold clarity, that the true transformation had only just begun. The days that followed the implantation blurred together, not because they were uneventful, but because the weight of transformation pressed so heavily on every moment that time itself felt like a hesitant observer, unsure whether it had permission to move forward. Each sunrise arrived with a muted glow filtered through the fortress's storm-worn windows, casting pale light over the training grounds where our bodies were now tested in ways far beyond the challenges we had known before the rebirth chamber. We were no longer simply children struggling to endure. We were something else, something half-formed, suspended in that fragile space between humanity and Astartes, between mortality and the faint promise of something transcendent. But the price of standing in that space was steep, and in the days that followed, I learned that the body was only the first battlefield. We woke each morning long before the sun rose, roused from our restless sleep by the thunderous march of armored boots in the corridors. Our bodies still ached from the surgeries, flesh tugging around foreign organs, bones adjusting to new growth, but there was no mercy granted. Pain was merely a reminder that we were changing. Pain was the tutor that never left our side. Even so, the discomfort felt strangely distant, as if a veil lay between our nerves and our awareness of them. The implants suppressed some sensations, heightened others, and twisted the remainder into signals that didn't yet make sense. I would wake to the feeling of my heartbeat skipping in strange rhythms, only to realize it was the new organ syncing itself with my cardiovascular system. I would feel a burn in my throat after drinking water, only to learn that my digestive tract was being reconditioned to process nutrients more efficiently. Every small detail of existence became a lesson in adjustment, but the changes to our bodies were nothing compared to the changes demanded of our minds, and the fortress was ready. Shape us on that front with a ruthlessness that made the trials of the labyrinth seem like games we had once played while ignorant of the true meaning of fear. The mental conditioning began without warning. One morning, as we were led into a new chamber, vast, circular, its walls lined with relics, armor plates, and ancient banners, the Astartes who presided over us ordered us to kneel before a row of luminescent data slates. Each device pulsed softly with a pale blue glow, the glyphs on their screens constantly shifting in patterns too complex to follow at first glance. We knelt on the cold metal floor as instructed, our breaths shallow in the frigid air, waiting for whatever new trial the chapter had devised to pry open our minds and reshape them into something battle-ready. "Today," the Astartes said, "you will confront truth." We didn't understand what he meant until the data slates activated simultaneously. A blinding rush of imagery flooded the screen visions of Tistam, battlefields stretching across broken worlds, legions of Astra Militarum regiments charging headlong into impossible odds, titans striding through ruins lit by Promethean fire, the void itself filled with silhouettes of ships locked in orbital war. The images weren't simply visual, they struck the mind directly, bypassing the eyes, embedding themselves as memories etched with uncanny clarity. The sound of bolter fire roared through my skull with the force of a physical blow. The screams of dying soldiers lodged in my ears long after the images flickered away. I tasted ash and metal on my tongue. I smelled the ozone of energy blasts tearing apart flesh. I felt the tremors of orbital bombardment in my bones. But the data slates didn't stop there. They showed us the truth of what it meant to be Astartes. Not the legends, not the stories sung in temples or retold by awestruck citizens on distant imperial worlds. It showed us brutal realities, Astartes torn apart by Xenos, monstrosities, space marines drowning in tides of tyrannids, warriors crushed beneath Necron constructs, so ancient their very presence radiated inevitability. It showed squads cut down in corridors flooded with poison gas, battle brothers dragged screaming into the warp by demonic claws, entire chapters extinguished in the time it took a single star to collapse into darkness. And threaded through each of these visions was a single unspoken message: greatness does not guarantee survival. By the time the data slates dimmed, my entire body trembled from the mental barrage. One of the other boys vomited on the floor, unable to contain the overload of sensory input. The Astartes did not acknowledge the weakness. Instead, he regarded us all with a gaze as cold as the northern winds that lashed against the fortress walls. "This is what awaits you," he said quietly. "War without end. You will witness horrors that the human mind is not meant to see. If you cannot accept that, leave." Now, none of us moved. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps pride, or perhaps we had simply crossed too many lines to retreat. In my mind, I tried to imagine returning to my old life after everything I had endured, but no such vision existed. The boy who had once run through the streets of my home city, laughing with the reckless innocence of childhood, was gone, burned away, buried beneath the implants and the training and the quiet, merciless grinding of the fortress's will. A few days later, the second stage of mental conditioning began. This time, there were no data slates, no imagery, no instructions. The Astartes led us into a dark chamber, illuminated solely by the flickering glow of wall-mounted torches. Shadows seemed to shift on the stone walls as if alive. The Astartes closed the door behind us and locked it. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed like a final judgment. We waited. Minutes passed, then hours. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs. Thirst dried our mouths. The darkness pressed in on us, unbroken except for the faint glimmers of torchlight. The walls felt as though they were inching closer with each passing moment, breathing slowly, deliberately. The silence grew so oppressive that even the faintest breath seemed like an intrusion. My mind drifted unwillingly into thoughts. I didn't want memories of the labyrinth, of the voices in the dark, of the children whose names I could no longer remember. When fear finally began to take hold, the Astartes returned. They entered silently, their armored boots barely making a sound. Without a word, the torches extinguished themselves, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Then something heavy hit the floor near us. "A body," one of the boys gasped. A metallic scent filled the chamber blood, fresh and warm. Panic rose in my chest. The darkness devoured every detail, every explanation, every direction. There was only the sound of our own heartbeats pounding like war drums in our ears. A voice whispered through the chamber, devoid of emotion, "Find your strength, or perish." Then something else began to move in the dark. To this day, I don't know whether the creature in the chamber was real or a hallucination induced by stress, exhaustion, or drugs the tech priests had introduced into our systems without our knowledge. All I know is that it felt real in every moment. I heard claws scrape across the stone. I heard breathing wet, heavy, predatory. I felt air shift as something large circled us. I felt it brush past me, a shiver of cold wind trailing in its wake. One of the boys screamed, another whispered a prayer to the Emperor, and in that darkness, I made a choice. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I forced my mind to focus, not on the creature, not on the fear, but on survival. The implants coursed through my veins with a faint, warm hum, reminding me that I was no longer the fragile child who had entered the fortress weeks before. I reached out into the fortress, dark, feeling with senses I didn't fully understand. My hearing sharpened, my awareness expanded. I found the creature not through sight, but through intuition sharpened by near-death training. When it lunged, I moved before I understood why. I tackled it, feeling its weight collapse beneath mine. It fought viciously, claws tearing at my skin, hot breath flooding my face. But I held on, refusing to let it escape, refusing to surrender to fear. I seized its throat and squeezed with all the strength the implants had begun to grant me. The creature thrashed, then weakened, then finally stilled. Silence settled over the chamber. When the torches reignited one by one, revealing the truth, my breath caught in my throat. The creature I had fought lay motionless on the floor. But it wasn't a monster. It was a servitor modified to simulate the presence of a predator, its limbs sharpened into blades, its sensory output distorted to terrify the mind. Its flesh was cold and pale, its blank eyes staring upward. The other boys stared at me with expressions I couldn't decipher. Fear, admiration, something in between. The Astartes stepped forward. "Your mind is adapting," he said quietly. "Good." From that day on, the conditioning escalated. We were shown nightmares and forced to navigate them without losing ourselves. We were drilled in strategy until our minds instinctively charted escape routes, weak points, and tactical advantages the moment we entered a room. We memorized litanies, battle prayers, weapon maintenance rituals, moral codes that bound the soul tighter than chains. Every moment was a test, a mold into which our identities were poured and reshaped. Weeks passed, and slowly I felt something awaken within me. Not just strength, not just resilience, but a sense of direction, a purpose that guided each breath, each step, each decision. The fortress had become more than a place of suffering. It had become a forge, and I was the metal being heated, hammered, and quenched into something new. Yet even as I transformed, a single question lingered at the edge of my thoughts, silent and patient. What would remain of me when the transformation was complete? The answer arrived on the morning we were summoned to the Hall of Vows. The enormous chamber was lined with braziers burning incense, so potent it made the air shimmer. Statues of ancient battle brothers loomed over us, their expressions carved with solemn resolve. The Astartes marched in formation, their armor gleaming like myth come to life. And at the center of the hall stood a stone altar engraved with runes older than the chapter itself. We were instructed to kneel. The chapter master himself stepped forward, his presence radiating authority so immense it felt like gravity. He studied us in silence for a long moment, as though weighing our souls. "You stand at the threshold," he said. "Not yet Astartes, not yet warriors, but no longer children. You have been broken and reforged. You have shed the weakness of your former selves. Today, you will kneel as initiates. Tomorrow, you will rise as aspirants." He raised his blade, placing its edge against each of our shoulders in turn. "From this day onward," he said, "your lives belong to the chapter. Your strength, your loyalty, your very being shall serve the eternal crusade. You will fight in wars unending. You will face horrors beyond mortal comprehension, and you will do so without fear. Then, soft enough that only we could hear, you will become legends." As the vow settled into my bones, as the incense blazed and the statues watched in silent approval, I felt the final shift take hold inside me. The boy I had been was truly gone. In his place stood someone new, someone forged in trial, baptized in agony, hardened in darkness, someone ready to walk the path toward becoming Astartes. And as the chapter master dismissed us, as the fortress trembled with distant thunder and the future stretched before us like an unending battlefield, I felt a single truth pulse through my veins with the certainty of a new heartbeat. I was no longer afraid. I was becoming.